Former Florida Senator Bob Graham co-chaired the investigation into the 9/11 attacks and today shares his unique perspective about the threats we face now and in the future. Next on UCF Metro Center Outlook.
This program is made possible by funding from the UCF Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies, where government leaders, business executives, and academic experts come together to discuss major issues facing the state of Florida.
Hello and welcome to Metro Center Outlook. I'm Diane Trees, Director of the UCF Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies and host of Metro Center Outlook. Bob Graham served 2 terms as Florida's governor and left Tallahassee with an impressive 83% approval rating. He went on to serve 3 terms as a U.S. Senator, spending 10 years on the Senate Intelligence Committee. He also co-chaired the investigation into the 9/11 attacks and helped establish the 9/11 Commission. A 38-year veteran of public office, he joins us today to discuss his newest book, Keys to the Kingdom, a fictional terrorism thriller. Senator Graham, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Diane.
You took 5 years writing this last book, and I understand it was inspired by your time as co-chairing the investigation into 9/11. Your other books are policy-oriented. What made you take a different route into fiction this time?
Frustration. The final report of our joint inquiry into 9/11 was over 800 pages. When it came back from the classification process, that's where it's reviewed to see if there's anything that may represent a national security problem. There was one chapter which was totally censored, and it was the chapter largely devoted to the Saudi role in 9/11. So from that point forward, I have felt that there were some important parts of the American experience around 9/11 that had been withheld from the American people. For a friend of mine who had had some similar experiences in the Defense Department was going to write a nonfiction book about those, as well as some recommendations for reform, and then he realized he couldn't write it because so much of the material was classified. He shifted gears and wrote a novel saying basically the same thing that he would have said, but with a novel the censorship bar is much lower because you're not representing it to be truth. So that sort of turned the light on in my head that maybe I could tell the story that I couldn't tell in nonfiction. I could tell it truthfully, but do it as a novel. So that's what Keys to the Kingdom was the result of that decision.
So you're saying that it's a blend of fiction, speculation possibly, and truth?
Yes, I would say that 40% of the novel is truth, with the exception that I changed the names of most of the living people. Another 40% is what I call informed speculation. It's fiction, yes, but it's not just fiction drawn out of the ether. It's based on a judgment of what might have been, for instance, some of the motivations of the Saudis and the United States during this period. And then the last 20% is a mixture of fact and speculation.
The book is fictional, but it does paint a very vivid picture of how dangerous our world has become. When you read it, what do you want your readers to come away with?
Well, first, I want them to be entertained. If you don't meet that standard as a novel, people don't...
Was that the fun part of writing a fiction?
Well, if you don't have an enjoyable experience, you're not going to... You'll probably read the first 20 or so pages and then put it away. But then beyond entertainment, I wanted it to give people some context in which to view not only things that have already happened, but things which I believe are on the horizon, and to be able to better understand why those events are occurring and what the United States policy should be towards those events.
Is it a sort of a warning or even a wake-up call? I know when I was reading it, it made me much more conscious of things, even though I knew that I was reading fiction, trying to delve into what was fiction and what was the fact.
Diane, I wish we could capture what you've just said. That'd be a wonderful advertisement for the book. You have stated exactly what the purpose was to entertain, but also to educate the reader. And if we accomplish that, thank you.
Well, you did. You did. One thing with the readers, and you have always been an advocate for citizens to be engaged in government. Did you write this with something in mind for action from your readers? That was another thing I brought out of it. I was ready to write my legislator.
Yes, I guess the answer is yes. I have been very interested, particularly in the years since I retired from the Senate, in citizenship, and unfortunately the decline in citizenship in America and what we can do to arrest that decline. And there is some of that in this book. I think the American people maybe have been too willing to accept things like excessive classification, where information that is not adverse to the national security but is embarrassing is withheld.
Well, and that's one thing in the book. You make a case for Saudi Arabia enabling some of the 9/11 terrorists. And you've long suggested a connection or a link between Al-Qaeda and Saudi Arabia. Why do you feel that connection exists?
Well, I would put that in the 40% true category. There's no question that Saudi Arabia provided significant assistance to at least those hijackers who were living in Southern California. There's been a recent disclosure about the possibility that there was similar assistance provided to 3 of the hijackers who were living near Sarasota. As to the motivations for the Saudis, I think the essential motivation was that bin Laden had challenged the Saudis that if they did not provide him with this assistance, which he understood was going to be critical to the ultimate success of 9/11, that he would unleash his 30,000 trained warriors who had just kicked the Russians out of Afghanistan against the monarchy in Saudi Arabia. And the monarchy decided that they would capitulate to bin Laden and make a network of Saudis available to the 19 hijackers so that they could do what they were called upon to do, which was to complete the planning, practice, and then execute a very complicated plot, and at the same time maintain anonymity.
We've had a beneficial relationship with the Saudi government since World War II. What do you see that needs to happen so that that continues in a positive manner?
Well, we need to be pragmatic about what motivates Saudi Arabia, and in my opinion it's one thing, and that is survival. Saudi Arabia is in some ways an unnatural country. It had been part of the Ottoman Empire up until World War I, then by fiat of particularly the French and the British, it was declared a nation state, but it was a very remote, desert, low population nation until oil was discovered. Then all of a sudden it became at least transformed in terms of its economic wealth, although many of its customs and religious traditions have continued, such as the limitation on the rights of women. They can't drive cars, they can't participate in political affairs, etc. So Saudi Arabia's goal is to survive as that kind of unusual country, and that the House of Saud, which has ruled Saudi Arabia from the beginning, continue to be the absolute authority over the lives of the people of Saudi Arabia.
You talk about the motivations there. How has the Arab Spring impacted or affected what the governing ruling in Saudi Arabia?
Not much to date.
You see
I sort of divide the countries in North Africa and the Middle East into 2 big categories, those that are oil rich and those that aren't. Those that are have the ability to essentially buy off their populations. Now, Libya is an exception to that rule. It is an oil-rich country, but their dictator, Gaddafi, had been so cruel and unrelenting in his negative behavior towards his own people that even he couldn't buy off the people when Arab Spring started. Saudi Arabia thus far has been able to do so. As an example,
so we'll have to see.
If you were an employee for a governmental agency in Saudi Arabia, and a high percentage of the people are, you this year get 14 checks for working 12 months. There also are some 500,000 units of low-income housing that have suddenly gone under construction. So the Saudi regime is using its enormous oil wealth, and it's the largest oil producer in the world. It sort of competes with Russia today but it is at least number 2. And with that, it has been able to placate the citizenry.
You were chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and you were very vocal about not approving going into Iraq. You wanted us to stay more focused with Afghanistan. Why did you feel that that was more significant to stay in Afghanistan?
First, because Afghanistan was a real war. It wasn't an optional. I mean, we had been attacked. 3,000 Americans had been killed by an organization that had been given harbor and assistance by the government of Afghanistan. So they were a legitimate enemy. We also, by the early months of 2002, were on the verge of completely eliminating Al-Qaeda. We had bin Laden trapped in the mountains.
Based in Afghanistan.
And also the Taliban government. We had toppled their regime, had taken over Kabul. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of victory, we were able to snatch defeat by shifting our attention from Afghanistan to a war of choice in Iraq based on what proved to be a false representation that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. I think that was the single most serious national security mistake that the United States has made, at least since Vietnam, and maybe going all the way back to Pearl Harbor.
With the death of bin Laden now, and a number of his chief lieutenants killed as well, how big a threat does Al-Qaeda still pose to the United States?
Significant, and part of the reason is that Al-Qaeda today is not Al-Qaeda as it was on in September the 11th of 2001. At that point, it was a very hierarchical organization with bin Laden making most of the significant decisions. Today, it has transformed into a franchise. It's like a McDonald's or Burger King with outposts in 60 or more countries. Some of those outposts, such as the one in Yemen, have become almost as big and almost as competent as big Al-Qaeda located in Pakistan. So while Al-Qaeda has certainly been affected by the loss of its leader and a number of the second-rank leaders in the organization, by this diversification, this franchise organization, they now have 60 leaders in 60 different places.
So are you suggesting we might be better at redirecting our anti-Al-Qaeda efforts more towards looking at perhaps Somalia or Yemen because of the...
The answer is yes, and I think that's actually what we're getting ready to do. My feeling is that what's going to happen is that we will accelerate the drawdown of our troops in Afghanistan, recognizing that first, there are less than 100 Al-Qaeda still left in Afghanistan, and second, winning a land war in Afghanistan was hard for Genghis Khan. The British couldn't do it in the 19th century. The Russians couldn't do it in the 20th century. I doubt if we're going to do it in the 21st century. And our real enemy are those terrorist organizations, and that the kind of effort, a successful attack against bin Laden himself, small group of people, highly trained with excellent intelligence, went in, performed a complicated mission, and then got out. I think that's going to be the kind of strategy for the rest of this war against Al-Qaeda, and yes, it is going to be waged not only in Afghanistan and particularly Pakistan, but is going to be in Somalia, Yemen, and possibly other places where Al-Qaeda has the capability of mounting attacks against the United States.
You mentioned in your book that Afghanistan was important in keeping Pakistan stable.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, how dangerous do you see Pakistan?
Well, we have I describe Pakistan as being like a marriage where both partners have a stake, but periodically they get into fusses and fights, and we're now at one of those periods with Pakistan. We've got a big interest in the stability of Pakistan for a number of reasons, one of which is that it has 100 nuclear weapons, and we've got a big stake that those weapons are maintained in a secure fashion so that they don't leak into the hands of a group like Al-Qaeda. They've got a big interest in us because we've been their principal military supplier. We also have been assisting them in trying to build up an economy and social institutions that will support a stable government. So it's a difficult marriage, but it's one in which both partners have enough interest in keeping it going that I think we'll find a way through the difficulties that we're currently experiencing.
I know you can't predict the future, but with the situation with Iraq, how do you see that working out? Do you see a possibility of a civil war with three factions separating, or?
Well, you've anticipated what my answer would be. Iraq is very much like Yugoslavia. They were both products of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. They were both based on the strategy of the Europeans that the way to keep down rebellious factors is to put them into a larger nation state. In the case of Yugoslavia, they had Slavs, they had Muslims, they had Christians, all of which had a history of hating each other. And as long as there was a strong leader, Tito, he kept the lid on those animosities. But as soon as he left the scene, they exploded, and now there is no more Yugoslavia. There are 5 or 6 sovereign nations. I'm afraid the same thing could happen in Iraq for exactly the same reason. They've got 3 groups that hate each other. They've got the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds. Yeah. And when the strong leader, Saddam Hussein, is gone, the United States military replaced him. When it's gone, can the country stay together, or will we have another explosion similar to Yugoslavia?
With the Arab Spring affecting so many different places over there, even though not Saudi Arabia so much yet, how do you see us? Is it always going to be military force with the cost of human life? When we reassess our relationships with these governments, do you see a possibility with the Arab Spring that we might be able to form relationships to sit down with possible political solutions? Is that completely out of?
Absolutely not. In fact, I think you're a very smart lady.
I don't think so. I'm reading what you wrote.
Well, and I think the role model, and it's not an exact analogy, but Central Europe had been under Nazi and then communist control for about 50 or 60 years when the Soviet Union finally collapsed. And there was a lot of concern as to what was going to happen to those countries in Central Europe. The United States got very involved in trying to assist them in the transition from communism to democracy and from a socialist type economy to a more market economy. And now, in the main, those countries such as the Czech Republic and Poland are doing very well and have a functioning democratic society. It's going to be more difficult in the Middle East and North Africa because they've had even less experience with democracy and markets than Central Europe. But I believe there are some lessons that we learned that could be modified and applied, and we could assist in this transition. I was very encouraged by the election that has just taken place in Tunisia, where 90% of the people voted. Wouldn't we like to have 90% of the people vote in one of our elections? Right. And by all accounts, it met standards of being free and fair. So now they've got a government that has the legitimacy of public support, and I think there's reason to be encouraged that while there will be some bumps in the road, that Tunisia is on a path towards a stable democratic government that will play a proper role in
You
the
sound
world
optimistic.
society. I am optimistic. I think ever since the American Revolution, the trend line of world history has been towards more freedom, more liberty, more democracy. It's gotten to some places earlier than others. It seems that now the stage for democracy is North Africa and the Middle East.
You have extensive experience with our intelligence agencies on many, many levels.
Mm-hmm.
One of the criticisms that you have vocalized is that we don't have an understanding of culture to put things in context with what we see and hear. We are not fluent in languages. Why is this so?
Well, it's so based on history. Our intelligence agencies were established at the beginning of the Cold War, and they were very much focused on the Cold War up until the fall of the Soviet Union. During the last period of that, after satellites became reliable, we started to back off from human intelligence, the spy gathering information, to a machine that was attached to a satellite that could either take a picture or intercept communications. So at the end of the Cold War, our intelligence agency was very ill-equipped to deal with the new threats, which came from nations that we didn't know much about, and from non-nation actors like Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda, which were not susceptible to running a camera over their caves and learning very much. You had to have a human being. And we've been struggling, and I think with some success, particularly in recent years, to get enough Americans who understand the languages and the cultures, frankly, particularly people who themselves have an ancestry in that area, and therefore they have an innate feeling and sense of the people, and they can fit in more easily, and we're getting better. The low point, frankly, in my judgment, was in Iraq before the war, when there were all these allegations of weapons of mass destruction. I remember at an intelligence committee meeting, closed session, I asked the head of the CIA, did we have somebody on the ground who was verifying the information about weapons of mass destruction? And the answer was no. And the reason, we didn't have anybody who was competent to carry out that function. We went to war exactly because we didn't have the capability of a human being who could go in and make a personal assessment based on the U.S. interest as to whether there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
So again, it focuses back on the relationships that we need to cultivate and understand who it is we're dealing with. It's so complex. Who can we trust?
Well, the answer is, I think trust may be the wrong word. I think the right word may be understand. I go back to the Saudi example. We've had a long relationship with Saudi Arabia, but it's not a love affair. It's based on self-interest. We're interested in their oil, they're interested in our defense because it helps them accomplish their fundamental objective of survival. So I would say that we need to approach the world with a high degree of pragmatism and realism as opposed to think that it's going to be some honeymoon forever relationship.
Right, so we're looking at the economic factors involved, strategic bases involved, and using those as a logical approach to coming to some conclusions without going to war.
Yeah,
hopefully that'll be that.
I would add to that that we need to have more understanding of the history, the cultures, as well as the languages of these areas so that we can better understand them and not be reliant on third parties and intermediaries who may have a different set of interests than we do.
And I think that would help us all around. Senator, thank you so much. You're so well versed on all of this. It's very complex, but I appreciate you sharing your insights and your time.
Well, thank you very much.
I've been talking with former U.S. Senator Bob Graham. With so much more to discuss, we'll continue our conversation on next week's show, delving into national security, terrorism, and oil. I'm Diane Trees. Thank you for joining me on UCF Metro Center Outlook, and tune in next week for more discussion with Senator Graham.